The moment Caleb Morrow crested the red dust ridge and spotted the woman standing alone on the Kansas trail with 3 enormous trunks and a broken-down wagon axle, he knew with the kind of bone-deep certainty that only comes to a man who has spent too many years talking to horses that his life was about to change in ways he could not yet name. It was the spring of 1874, and the Santa Fe Trail was alive with the restless energy of a nation still stitching itself back together after the ravages of the war. The prairie stretched out in every direction like a golden ocean, the tall grass bending and rising in waves beneath a wind that carried the faint perfume of wildflowers and red earth. The sky overhead was the kind of blue that artists back east spent entire careers trying to capture, and never quite managed, vast and cloudless and indifferent to the small dramas of the people passing beneath it. Caleb was 31 years old, lean and sun-darkened, with calloused hands that told the story of a decade spent working cattle ranches from Texas to Colorado. He wore a battered brown hat that had seen more weather than most men ever would, and his eyes were the particular shade of gray-green that the prairie itself sometimes turned in the hour before a thunderstorm. He was riding south from Abilene with a modest commission from a rancher named Duval, who wanted 2 breeding stallions delivered to his spread near Dodge City. The horses, a dun and a black, were tied behind his own roan gelding, and they had been behaving themselves tolerably well until this moment, when the black one caught whatever scent the wind was carrying and started tossing his head with renewed interest. Caleb brought all 3 animals to a slow stop at the edge of the ridge and studied the scene below him with careful eyes. The woman was not in distress, exactly. That was the first thing he noticed, and it struck him as unusual because a lone woman with 3 trunks and a ruined wagon axle on an empty stretch of the Santa Fe Trail had every reason in the world to be in distress. Instead, she was standing with her hands on her hips, surveying the wreckage of the axle with the kind of calm, calculating look that a general might give a battlefield. She had pushed her bonnet back so that it hung between her shoulders by its ribbons, and her dark hair, pinned up but coming loose at the edges in the most unhurried way possible, caught the afternoon light and held it. Her dress was practical brown linen, trail-worn but clean, and she was wearing boots that looked as though they had been resoled at least twice. Beside her sat 3 large leather-bound trunks, black with brass fittings, lined up in a row with almost mathematical precision, as though she had taken the time to arrange them neatly before deciding what to do next. The broken wagon stood at an angle off the side of the trail, its front axle snapped clean through, one wheel lying flat in the dust several feet away like a discarded hoop. There was no other person in sight. No driver, no companion, no horse. Caleb nudged the roan forward down the ridge. She heard him coming and turned to watch his approach without the flinching wariness that most women alone on the trail would have shown. She simply watched him, her brown eyes steady and appraising, her chin lifted at an angle that communicated clearly she was not someone who needed rescuing so much as someone who was choosing, very deliberately, to accept assistance when it was offered reasonably. He reined up about 10 feet away and touched the brim of his hat. "Afternoon," he said. "Afternoon," she replied. Up close, she was younger than he had first supposed, perhaps 25 or 26, with a face that was strong-featured rather than conventionally pretty, the kind of face that rewarded looking twice. There was a smear of axle grease on her left cheek that she either did not know about or did not care about, and given the way she was looking at him, he suspected it was the latter. "Caleb Morrow," he said. "I'm headed south toward Dodge." "Clara Ashworth," she said. "I was headed there too until about 3 hours ago when my axle decided otherwise." She glanced at the ruined wagon with the expression of someone who had already done their grieving and moved on. "My driver took the horse to ride ahead and find help. He left roughly 2.5 hours ago and has not returned, which tells me either the nearest town is farther than he estimated, or he has decided that his obligations to me ended the moment he was out of sight. Caleb considered this. Nearest settlement is Cooper's Crossing, about 8 miles east. Man on horseback could make that in under an hour. Then we can assume the latter, she said, without bitterness, just a flat acknowledgement of a fact she had apparently already arrived at. Which leaves me with 3 trunks, a broken wagon, and the very great inconvenience of being approximately 40 miles from where I need to be. What's in the trunks? Caleb asked because it seemed relevant given that he had 2 horses and a commission to fulfill and could not simply carry everything. She looked at him evenly. Everything I own. He nodded slowly. That's honest. Find honesty saves time, she said. He looked at the trunks, then at his horses, then back at her. The sun was still a good 3 hours from setting. If they traveled smart, they could make decent progress before dark. He had a bedroll and enough dried provisions for 2 days. It was not a simple situation, but it was a manageable one, and Caleb Morrow had spent his adult life managing situations that were not simple. The black stallion can carry 2 of the trunks if we balance them right, he said. The 3rd we can rope to the back of my saddle. It'll be slow going and Duval won't be happy about how I'm treating his horses, but it's doable. You'd ride the dun. She blinked at him. It was the first time her composure shifted even slightly. You would do that? For a stranger? I'm not doing it for a stranger, he said. I'm doing it because it's the right thing and because standing out here on an empty trail for 3 hours has apparently not done you any particular harm, but waiting another 3 might. He paused. I'll be honest with you, too. I've got a delivery to make and a schedule to keep, but can get you to Dodge. It'll take us 2 days the way we'll be traveling. Clara Ashworth looked at him for a long, measuring moment. Then she nodded once as though she had completed some internal calculation and found the answer satisfactory. 2 days, she said. All right, Mr. Morrow. Caleb, he said. All right, Caleb, she said. The trunks are heavier than they look. He swung down from the roan. They always are. He was not wrong. The trunks were extremely heavy, and loading them required 20 minutes of genuine effort, creative rope work, and 2 separate instances of Caleb wishing he had paid more attention to the knot-tying lessons of his youth. Clara did not stand aside and watch. She lifted her end of each trunk without being asked, and she was stronger than her frame suggested. When they finally had everything secured, 2 trunks balanced across the black stallion's back in a configuration that made the animal pin his ears, but except the burden, Caleb boosted Clara onto the dun, and then mounted the roan, and they set off south with the late afternoon sun cutting long golden shadows across the trail. They did not speak much for the first hour. Caleb was accustomed to silence. The prairie offered it in abundance, and he had made his peace with solitude years ago. But this silence was different from the usual kind. It was not empty. Clara rode beside him with the easy seat of someone who had spent time in the saddle, her posture relaxed, her eyes moving across the landscape with a quality of attention that he recognized and respected. She was actually looking at things, not just watching them pass. You're not from Kansas, he said eventually. Ohio, she said. Originally, most recently Philadelphia. Long way to come, he said, to Dodge City. Yes, she agreed. He waited to see if she would say more. She did not immediately. They rode another quarter mile before she spoke again. I have a position there, she said, teaching. There's a new schoolhouse. They've been advertising for a teacher for 8 months and nobody wanted to come, which I found encouraging rather than discouraging. Caleb glanced at her. How do you figure? If nobody wanted the position, it means it's genuinely needed, she said. Empty positions in comfortable places aren't as useful. He thought about that. You chose to come somewhere hard on purpose. Chose to go somewhere could actually do something that mattered, she corrected, mildly but firmly. There's a difference. He found himself nodding. There was a difference. He had spent years working ranches where he was one of 20 hands, doing work that would have been done by someone else if he had not been there. The thought had never sat entirely comfortably with him. What about the 3 trunks? he asked. Teachers don't usually travel with 3 trunks. For the first time, something that was almost a smile crossed her face. No, they don't. 1 trunk is my clothing and personal effects. 1 trunk is books. The 3rd is school supplies, slates, chalk, primers, readers. I bought what I could in Philadelphia before I left because I was fairly sure that Dodge City would not have a well-stocked mercantile for educational materials. You figured right, he said. Dodge City has a well-stocked mercantile for ammunition and whiskey. She made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. Yes, I expected something of that sort. The sun was getting lower now, painting the prairie in shades of orange and pink that Caleb had seen 1,000 times and never quite gotten used to. He started looking for a campsite somewhere with water nearby and enough natural windbreak to make a fire sensible. He found it a mile later, where a shallow creek curved through a stand of cottonwoods, the trees still wearing the bright new green of early spring. He helped Clara down from the dun. She accepted the assistance this time without comment, and they worked together to set up the camp with a kind of easy, intuitive division of labor that surprised him. She gathered wood while he saw to the horses, and by the time he had them watered and hobbled, she had a decent fire going and a flat-topped rock pulled up to serve as a table of sorts. I have hardtack and dried beef, he said, pulling out his provisions. I have cheese and the last of a loaf of bread I bought yesterday morning in Abilene, she said, producing these from a canvas bag she had been carrying on the saddle. It's slightly stale. Cheese and bread beats hardtack, he said. Almost everything does, she agreed. They ate in the firelight, the cottonwoods whispering overhead and the creek making its small, persistent music somewhere in the dark beyond the tree line. The prairie at night was its own particular kind of magnificent. The stars out here were not the polite, distant stars you saw from a city, but enormous and close, crowded together in the kind of display that made a person feel simultaneously very small and strangely significant. Clara tilted her head back to look at them. I didn't expect it to be so beautiful, she said quietly. I expected to find it harsh. It's both, Caleb said. That's what people who haven't been here don't understand. It doesn't choose. She lowered her gaze from the stars and looked at him across the fire. In the firelight, the smear of axle grease on her cheek had been cleaned away. She must have used the creek, and her hair was still half pinned, half loose, and the light made it something extraordinary. He looked away. How long have you been doing this? She asked. The cattle work, the horses, the trail. Since I was 18, he said. 13 years. Do you like it? He considered the question seriously because she had asked it seriously. I like the horses, he said. I like the open country, like knowing exactly what the work requires and doing it. What don't like is that it's never mine. The horses aren't mine, the land isn't mine, the cattle aren't mine. I'm good at taking care of things that belong to other people. She was quiet for a moment. Do you want something of your own? The question landed somewhere in his chest with unexpected weight. He poked at the fire. I've been thinking about it more lately, he said. There's good land along the Cimarron southeast of Dodge, quarter sections available if a man files the right paperwork and is willing to work. A ranch of your own, she said. Something like it, he said. Maybe. She nodded slowly, and there was something in her expression, not pity, not condescension, but a kind of genuine recognition. The way one person sometimes looks at another when they understand exactly what they're saying because they are saying the same thing in different words. She had left Ohio and then Philadelphia and traveled 1,100 miles to a place that the people she left behind had called dangerous and uncivilized and wholly unsuitable for a woman alone, because she wanted something that was hers, a purpose that was hers, a life that was hers, built on ground she had chosen herself. I think you should file the paperwork, she said. He looked at her. She was looking at the fire. I think you should, he said, and she looked up then, and they both understood they were not talking about land anymore, not entirely, and neither of them was quite ready to say so. They slept that night on opposite sides of the fire, Clara wrapped in the extra blanket she had produced from the canvas bag and Caleb in his bedroll, and the Prairie breathed around them under its blanket of stars. He woke first, as he always did in the gray pre-dawn, and put coffee on before attending to the horses. He used his small, battered tin pot and the coffee grounds he always carried, and by the time Clara stirred and sat up, the smell of it had reached her. She sat up with her hair thoroughly undone now, dark and loose around her shoulders, and she blinked at the coffee pot with an expression of such naked gratitude that he almost laughed. "You made coffee," she said. "Always make coffee," he said. "It's one of the few things I do that's non-negotiable." She accepted the tin cup he handed her with both hands and drank it black without complaint. He noted this. He had known men who complained about trail coffee, and he had never trusted them fully afterwards. "We should be moving before the heat comes up," he said. "How far today?" she asked. "If we make good time, we can reach Hartley station by evening. It's not much a trading post and a few buildings, but they'll have proper food and you can sleep inside." "I slept fine outside," she said, and she meant it. He checked the trunk ropes while she repinned her hair with a handful of pins she produced from somewhere in the canvas bag, her fingers moving through the motions with practiced efficiency, and he made himself focus on the ropes, and not on the way the early light caught the dark mass of her hair before it was put away. They set out as the sun broke over the eastern horizon, painting the whole world briefly in shades of copper and rose. The horses moved well in the cool morning air, and the trail was empty except for them and the occasional meadowlark singing from a fence post or a stretch of wild grass. "Tell me about Philadelphia," he said, after they had been riding a while in the easy silence that had established itself between them as a comfortable habit already. Clara considered where to start. "It's loud," she said, "and crowded and extraordinary and exhausting. I grew up in a small town in Ohio. My father was a schoolteacher, actually, which is where I learned to love it, and I went to Philadelphia when I was 20 to study. There was a women's college associated with the Quaker community, and I was fortunate enough to receive a scholarship." "What did you study?" "Education and literature primarily," she said, "though I read everything I could get my hands on. The library there was remarkable. Spent more time in it than was probably strictly required by my coursework." A small smile. "My professors found me occasionally exasperating because kept asking questions that went off the syllabus." "That sounds like you," he said, and then caught himself, because he had known this woman for less than 24 hours, and he was already forming a picture of her that felt like knowing. She glanced at him with something quickening in her eyes. "Does it?" "From what little I know," he said carefully. "What little you know," she repeated, but she was almost smiling again, and she let it go. "Your father," he said. "He approved of you coming out here." The smile faded slightly, not into grief exactly, but into something more complicated. "My father died 2 years ago," she said. "He would have approved, I think. My mother is considerably less certain about all of it. We had a thorough and very loud disagreement in the front parlor of her house in February before I left." She paused. "She called me stubborn and impractical." "Are you?" "Stubborn, certainly," she said. "Impractical, I prefer to think not. I brought 3 trunks of school supplies to a frontier town that has had no school for 3 years. I have a signed contract with the town council of Dodge City, and I have enough money saved from 2 years of teaching in Philadelphia to sustain myself for 6 months if needed. That is not impractical. That is thorough planning." He thought about this. And the 3 trunks specifically were part of the thorough planning. "The 3 trunks were absolutely essential," she said, with a conviction that was both funny and completely serious. "You cannot teach reading without books. You cannot teach writing without slates. You cannot teach arithmetic without proper primers." Was not going to arrive in Dodge City and discover that had to wait 3 months for supplies to come from St. Louis. "So you carried them yourself," he said. "Across the Kansas prairie." "Across the Kansas prairie," she confirmed, "and I have 0 regrets about it." He felt it then, a warm, ungovernable thing that he was not entirely prepared for, rising up from somewhere below his sternum. Zero regrets. She said it the way other people said facts, plainly and without decoration, and it was the most attractive quality he had encountered in another person in years. He looked straight ahead at the trail and told himself to concentrate on the horses. Hartley Station appeared in the late afternoon exactly as he had described it, a collection of low buildings around a trading post, with a water trough and a hitching rail, and a hand-painted sign that had been weathered to near illegibility. A heavy-set man named Orville Hartley ran it with his wife, Bess, who was small and quick-eyed, and who took one look at Clara, and immediately brought her inside to feed her properly and hear the story of the broken axle. Caleb saw to the horses, settled the trunks in the trading post storeroom under Orville's watchful eye, and then accepted the plate of beef stew and cornbread that Bess pressed on him with the authority of someone who equated food with care and did not take no for an answer. The trading post had 2 rooms for travelers, small and plain, with rope-strung beds and clean enough blankets. Caleb paid for both without discussion, and Clara accepted this with a nod and a look that said she was noting it and that they would address it later. That evening, after supper, the 4 of them sat on the trading post's narrow porch while the last of the daylight faded from the sky. Bess asked Clara what had brought her out west, and Clara told it straight: the teaching position, the schoolhouse, the contract, the 3 trunks, and Bess listened with increasing admiration that she made no effort to conceal. "Lord knows Dodge could use a schoolteacher," Bess said. "I have a niece who moved there with her husband 2 years ago. She has 3 children and there's nothing for them but to run wild. She'd be grateful." "Then I hope she'll send them," Clara said. "She will if I tell her to," Bess said with cheerful certainty. Orville told them that a cattle drive had come through 2 days previous, heading north on the Kishom to Abilene, and that a deputy sheriff from Dodge had ridden through yesterday chasing a man wanted for horse theft. The frontier news of the day, compact and complete. Caleb listened and watched Clara in the peripheral way he had been practicing since yesterday, the way she engaged with Bess and Orville, asking genuine questions, listening to the answers with real attention, laughing when Orville told a story about a traveling medicine man whose wagon had lost both its rear wheels simultaneously coming down the ridge last summer. She had an easy way with people that was not performance. It was simply the natural result of someone who found other people genuinely interesting. He realized with a start, in very serious trouble. He went to bed in his small room and lay looking at the ceiling in the dark for a while, listening to the prairie wind find the gaps in the building's boards and whistle through them. He was 31 years old. He had not been a monk. There had been a woman in Abilene some years back, and another in Colorado before that, but nothing that had lasted, nothing that had felt inevitable. His life had been, by design or default, a solitary one. He had made his peace with it. He had the sense, lying there in the dark, that he was being asked to reconsider. In the morning, Bess had breakfast on the table before the sun was fully up: eggs, which were a luxury on the trail, and more of her excellent corn bread. Clara ate with the focused appreciation of someone who understood that good food, like good luck, was not to be taken lightly. After breakfast, while Caleb was reorganizing the rope work on the trunks, Clara stood at the trading post counter buying a few things: more cheese, a length of ribbon for reasons she did not explain, and a small tin of peppermint candy which she put in the canvas bag, and from which she offered him one as they rode out. He took it because declining small kindnesses was a poor habit. The second day's riding took them through country that opened up even further, the grassy swells of the prairie giving way in places to stretches of more dramatic terrain, low bluffs and dry creek beds that required careful navigation. The horses picked their way through with practiced calm, and the black stallion had apparently decided to forgive the indignity of the trunks and was behaving admirably. It was mid-morning when they heard the distant sound of horses riding hard from the east. Caleb's hand went to the rifle in its saddle scabbard, not urgently, but with the quiet readiness of long practice, and he turned the roan sideways on the trail to look. 3 riders appeared over a rise, coming fast, and as they got closer he could make out the glint of a deputy's badge on the lead rider. The deputy pulled up in a cloud of dust, a lean, sunburned man of perhaps 40, and took in the scene in front of him with the quick professional assessment of someone who had been doing this a while. "Caleb Morrow," he said, recognizing him. His name was Garrett, and Caleb had met him twice in Dodge City. "Deputy Garrett," Caleb said. Garrett's eyes moved to Clara and the trunks and back to Caleb. "Escort duty?" he asked. "She needed a hand," Caleb said simply. "We're looking for a man," Garrett said. He described the horse thief, sandy-haired, riding a stolen buckskin, heading toward Dodge ahead of a cattle drive. "You seen anyone on the trail?" "Passed a homesteader's wagon yesterday morning, family heading north," Caleb said. "Nobody since?" Garrett nodded and made a motion to his 2 companions. "We'll cut south, ma'am." He touched his hat to Clara, and the 3 of them thundered off, and the trail went quiet again. Clara watched them go. "Is this a typical morning?" she asked. "On this stretch?" "Fairly typical," Caleb said. "The trail brings everyone through. Cattlemen, settlers, lawmen, and the people lawmen are looking for. And teachers with 3 trunks," she added. "First time I've encountered that combination," he admitted. She looked at him sidelong. "Is that a compliment or an observation?" "Both," he said, and she laughed, a real laugh, not a polite one, full and warm and genuine, and it did something to the afternoon light that Caleb could not have explained to anyone's satisfaction, including his own. They stopped at noon in the shade of a limestone outcropping, where the trail curved around a shallow pond fed by an underground spring. Caleb knew this stretch well, and had planned for this stop. The horses drank gratefully. Clara took off her boots and put her feet in the water at the pond's edge, with the unceremonious practicality of someone who had decided that blisters were beneath her dignity and was taking preventive measures. Caleb sat on a flat rock nearby, eating hardtack because the bread was gone, and tried not to watch her watching the pond. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said, without looking up from the water. "You can ask," he said. "Why are you alone?" she said. "Not in the lonesome sense. I mean a man who does what you do as well as you clearly do, who is as straightforward and decent as you appear to be, who thinks about land along the Cimarron and what might be his. Why hasn't any of that happened yet?" He was quiet for a long time. A dragonfly landed on the surface of the pond and lifted off again. "I don't know that I have a good answer," he said honestly. "The work keeps moving, and I've kept moving with it. There was a woman in Colorado in '70. Margaret. She was a rancher's daughter, and she was wonderful, and I was 27 and too certain that I had more wandering to do before I was fit to give anything to anyone." He paused. "She married someone else the following year, a good man. Heard they're doing well. Do you regret it?" Clara asked. He considered this. "I regret that I wasn't ready then," he said. "I don't think I regret the outcome exactly, because I'm not sure it was the right fit, which is a coward's way of saying I don't know." Clara pulled her feet from the water and looked at them, pink-toed and clean. "I don't think that's cowardly," she said. "Think it's honest." "You use that word a lot," he said. "Honest?" She glanced at him. "It matters a lot to me." "Why specifically?" She was quiet for a moment, lacing her boots back up with quick, sure movements. "My father was an honest man," she said. Profoundly, sometimes inconveniently honest. He was a school teacher for 22 years, and he never told a student they were doing better than they were, but he also never told one they were incapable. He said those were 2 forms of the same lie. She smoothed her skirt and stood. "I grew up watching him and thinking that honesty was the most respectful thing one person could offer another. It says, think you can handle the truth. Think you're strong enough for it." Caleb stood too, brushing trail dust from his trousers. He was standing closer to her than he had intended, and he could see the exact shade her eyes were not simply brown, but a warm amber brown shot through with something darker, like good whiskey held up to the light. "Your father sounds like a man worth admiring," he said quietly. "He was," she said just as quietly. They looked at each other for a moment that stretched past comfortable and into something else, something neither of them had arranged or intended. And then the black stallion chose that moment to voice a loud, irritated opinion about the sun and the trunks and the general indignity of his day. And they both turned to deal with it, and the moment closed itself up like a flower at nightfall. But it did not disappear. They reached the southern edge of the main trail by late afternoon and turned onto the road that would take them the final stretch into Dodge City. The landscape here began to show signs of the town's proximity. The ruts in the road deepened by thousands of cattle hooves, the occasional fence post, the distant thin line of smoke against the sky that meant industry and habitation. Clara sat up straighter on the dun as the outskirts of Dodge came into view, and Caleb watched her take it in. He tried to see it through her eyes. It was, by any objective measure, a rough-edged, unbeautiful place, a main street lined with false-fronted buildings, the smell of cattle and horses and wood smoke, the shout of a man from somewhere inside the Long Branch saloon that carried halfway down the block. There were people everywhere in the late afternoon, cowboys fresh off the trail, businessmen in respectable coats, women walking with purposeful speed, a group of Osage men on horseback moving along the eastern edge of the street, with the contained dignity of people who were navigating a world that had recently been theirs in a way that made every stop on this street carry an invisible weight. Caleb had always felt that weight. He was not Osage and had no standing to feel it on their behalf, but he had spent enough time on this land to understand, at least partially, what it meant that it was no longer theirs in the ways it had been, and he had never been able to be entirely comfortable with that knowledge. It was one of the complexities of the frontier that the dime novels back east never quite managed to account for, that the Wild West was beautiful and harsh and full of injustice layered on top of injustice, and that the people making their futures here were doing so on ground that other people had already lost. He watched Clara notice the Osage riders too and saw something shift in her expression, not pity, which would have been condescending, but a kind of careful, grave acknowledgement. "I read about the Osage land agreements," she said quietly as they rode. "Before I came." "Did you?" he said. "I wanted to understand where I was coming to," she said, "not just the geography." She paused. There were children in Philadelphia, the daughters and sons of people from all kinds of places, taught some of them in an informal capacity through the community center there. What children needed was always the same regardless of where their parents were from. "Intend to run my school on that basis." He looked at her. "That may not be a simple principle to uphold in Dodge City," he said carefully. "There are people here who will have opinions. People with opinions are not a problem, have ever been intimidated by," she said, with perfect composure. He believed her entirely. He took her first to the town council office because she had a contract and an appointment, and it was the logical first step, and because he was not ready to drop her at a boarding house and ride away, which was what the sensible conclusion of his errand told him he should do. The town council was represented in the late afternoon by a single councilman, a portly fellow named Prescott, who seemed both relieved and slightly alarmed by Clara's arrival, as though he had not entirely believed she would come, and now that she had, the reality of a competent woman making demands of him was somewhat overwhelming. She had her contract out within 30 seconds of sitting down. She had questions about the schoolhouse, its condition, its dimensions, its furnishing or lack thereof. She had a list. She had written the list, Caleb observed from the chair in the corner where he had settled himself, in a small neat hand that covered both sides of a single page. Prescott answered her questions in the manner of a man being very carefully moved in a direction he had agreed to go, but was now finding steeper than expected. Caleb watched this with profound enjoyment. The schoolhouse, it emerged, was a single room on the north end of town. Recently completed, the walls were up and the roof was on, but the interior was bare of everything except good intentions. There was no stove yet, no shelving, no desks. Prescott promised these things would be addressed. Clara wrote down the promises with the careful attention of someone who fully intended to hold him to every word. She had a room arranged at a boarding house, Widow Patterson's, which Prescott recommended as the most respectable establishment in town and which, Caleb knew from previous stays in Dodge, was run by a severe but fair woman who kept a clean house and served excellent biscuits. He carried her trunks from the horses to the boarding house, making 3 trips, and on the 3rd trip Clara met him at the door and looked at him with an expression that was complicated in ways he was still learning to read. "Caleb," she said. "Clara," he said. "I owe you a great deal," she said. "You've been—" She stopped, as if looking for the exact right word, which he was coming to understand was something she always did. "You've been extraordinarily kind." "I've been going south," he said. "You needed to go south." "Don't do that," she said. "Do what?" "Diminish it," she said. "It matters when people are good. It should be allowed to matter." He stood with the last trunk in his arms, in the doorway of the Patterson boarding house, looking at Clara Ashworth, and something in him that had been held carefully in reserve for a very long time stepped forward without permission. "It was 2 days," he said. "The best 2 days I've had in longer than I can honestly tell you." Her expression shifted, opened, something warm and unguarded moving through it before she got it back under control. "I have to get settled," she said. "Duval is waiting for his horses." "He is," Caleb said, "but you'll still be in Dodge for a day or 2. She said, and the casualness of it was slightly too careful to be casual. "I'll need to collect Duval's payment and make arrangements for my return north," he said. "A couple of days at least." "Then perhaps I'll see you," she said. "Perhaps you will," he agreed and carried the trunk inside. He delivered the stallions to Duval's man at the stock pens. The following morning Duval himself was in town, staying at the Dodge house, and received his horses with the satisfaction of a man who valued good bloodlines and paid accordingly. Caleb collected his commission, a fair amount, enough to add meaningfully to the savings he had been building in a canvas roll in his saddlebag, and spent the morning at the livery stable seeing to the roan, who had earned a rest and some good grain. By noon, he was walking up Front Street with a purpose that was not entirely accounted for by the errand of finding lunch. The schoolhouse was on the north end of town, and he had no reason to go to the north end of town. He went there anyway. Clara had the door open. She had been there since, apparently, early morning, judging by the amount of work that had already been done. She had swept the floor. He could see the dust piled in a corner. She had measured the windows with a piece of string and written the measurements in her notebook. She was currently standing in the center of the empty room with the notebook in one hand and her other hand extended, physically counting out paces to determine desk placement. She looked up when his shadow fell across the open doorway. "You came," she said. Not surprised exactly, almost pleased in a way she was choosing not to fully express. "I was in the neighborhood," he said. She gave him a look that communicated clearly that she understood exactly what that meant and that she was going to allow it to go unremarked upon. "I need shelving on that wall," she said, pointing, "and I need to know whether the wood supplier on 2nd Street is reliable." "He's reliable for rough lumber," Caleb said. "If you want finished shelving, you'd need to speak with the cabinet maker, whose shop is on Chestnut." She wrote this down. "I don't suppose you know how to build shelves," she said, in the tone of someone who suspects the answer is yes and is approaching the question circumspectly. "I know how to build shelves," he confirmed. She looked up from her notebook and met his eyes, and the smile that she had been keeping in careful reserve broke through then, full and undefended and devastating. "Of course you do," she said. He built the shelves that afternoon and the following morning. Using lumber he and Clara selected together from the wood supplier on 2nd Street, Clara bargaining with the directness of someone who had done her research and knew exactly what things should cost, leaving the man behind the counter faintly dazed. The cabinetmaker on Chestnut agreed to provide 2 finished display pieces for a price that Clara negotiated to something reasonable with the same unruffled thoroughness. While Caleb worked, Clara arranged the books from the 2nd trunk onto the shelves he had finished, organizing them with a system that she explained to him, and that was entirely logical: readers by level, reference volumes by subject, the primers in a row at the front where they would be easiest to access. She narrated her thinking as she worked, not because she needed anyone's input, but because she was the kind of person who processed out loud, and he found that he liked being the person she processed to. They had lunch brought from the small cafe on Front Street by Caleb, who went and came back while Clara was mid-sentence about geography primers, and simply accepted the sandwich from his hand and kept talking, and they had supper at the cafe itself, sitting across from each other at a corner table while the Dodge City evening went on around them. The thump and noise of the saloons down the street, the clatter of a freight wagon going past, the voices of people at other tables talking about cattle and weather and gossip. "You're staying," Clara said. It was not a question. Caleb looked at the coffee cup in his hands. He had told himself he was leaving day after tomorrow. He had told himself that very firmly and repeatedly since yesterday morning. "I haven't decided," he said, which was honest if not as certain as it should have been. "You have a life in motion," she said. "Work, commissions. You're not a man who stays still." "I've been thinking about filing that paperwork," he said. "The land along the Cimarron." She was quiet for a moment. "That's a significant thing to do." "It is." "Caleb," she set her own cup down and looked at him directly, and there it was again, the thing she had said on the trail about honesty being the most respectful thing one person could offer another. She was about to offer it. "I want to be honest with you because think you deserve it. In 2 days on the trail and 2 days here, have found you to be one of the most genuinely good people I have ever met. And I am," she stopped, took a breath, "am finding myself significantly unwilling to see you ride away." The cafe had other people in it. There was noise. Caleb was aware of none of it. "That's honest," he said very quietly. "Told you it saves time," she said. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, just his hand over hers, warm and careful, and she looked down at it and then back up at him and did not move her hand away. "I was thinking about filing the paperwork," he said again, "because I would like to have somewhere to be. Somewhere that is mine, and that could offer a reason to stay to someone who had chosen a difficult and important thing to come here for." Clara Ashworth was not a woman who cried in public or, he suspected, in much of any context, but her eyes were very bright in the lamplight. "That is the most indirect declaration I have ever heard," she said. "I'm working up to it," he said. "Take your time," she said, and turned her hand under his so that their fingers interlaced, warm and certain. The paperwork for the land along the Cimarron took 3 days to locate the right office, 2 conversations with a land agent named Hollies who was thorough if slow, and a full morning of Caleb riding 20 miles southeast of Dodge to walk the quarter section he was considering. He came back with mud on his boots and an expression on his face that Clara read correctly the moment she saw him standing in the schoolhouse doorway. "You loved it," she said. "The creek runs year-round," he said. "There's a natural limestone shelf that would serve as a foundation. The grass is good." He paused. "It's good land, Clara." She came to where he was standing and put her hand on his arm, and he looked at her hand and then at her face and said, "Filed the claim this afternoon." She put her other hand over his and held it. "Good," she said. "That is very good." The school opened 3 weeks later than Clara had hoped, but sooner than Prescott had privately expected, with 14 children on the first morning, ranging from 6 to 13 years of age. Caleb came and stood outside and watched through the open window as Clara stood at the front of her classroom, with the calm confidence of someone who had been born to this exact moment, writing the date on the new chalkboard that had been installed last week. May 12, 1874. She asked the children their names and wrote each one down in her register book, and the way each child's name became real and official in the writing of it was something that even from outside the window, even through the dusty glass, Caleb could feel. He stood there for a long time before he went to start the day's work on the land claim. The work on the homestead, he had started calling it that in his mind, which was a development that felt both terrifying and absolutely right, was substantial. The claim was raw land. He began with the creek, clearing the overgrowth from its banks so the water ran clean, and then started on the foundation, using the limestone shelf as Clara had suggested when he had shown her the land 2 weeks prior. She had stood in the middle of the quarter section with her skirts brushing the tall grass and had said, "The house should face east, so you get the morning light, and you should put the kitchen garden on the south side where it will have sun all day." He had built the house facing east. He was not a carpenter by trade, but he was a man who could figure out what needed doing and do it methodically, and he had help from 2 men he hired from among the cowboys wintering in Dodge, a quiet, experienced builder named Santos, who had come up from Texas with a cattle drive and decided to stay, and a younger man named Pete who was handy with tools and worked hard and asked no unnecessary questions. Between the 3 of them, and with the lumber they hauled out from Dodge on a borrowed wagon, they had the frame up within 2 weeks, and the walls and roof following in the weeks after that. Clara came out on Sunday afternoons, riding a steady little mare she had purchased from the Dodge livery. She had approached this transaction with the same focused competence she brought to everything, asking about the horse's history and wind and feet with questions that surprised the liveryman into honest answers. She would arrive at the homestead with the canvas bag and produce from it, with unfailing regularity, something useful: nails she had purchased in town, a coil of rope, once an entire ham from the butcher, and always peppermint candy. On these Sunday afternoons, they worked and talked, and the talking went deeper each week, the way conversations do between people who are paying genuine attention to each other. He told her about his childhood in Missouri, the farm his parents had lost when he was 12, the older brother who had gone to the war and come back changed in ways that nobody talked about directly. She told him about her years in Philadelphia, the arguments she had had with her professors, the students she had worried about in the middle of the night, the letter she had written to the Dodge City Town Council on a cold January evening, and then held in her hand for 20 minutes, deciding whether to send it. "What made you send it?" he asked. They were sitting on the limestone foundation of what would be the east wall of the house, and the evening light was doing its usual extraordinary things to the prairie, and Clara was looking at the horizon with the expression he was coming to know as her deepest thinking face. "I thought about what my father would have said," she said. "He would have said, 'Clara, the only thing worse than failing at the thing you want is never trying it because you were afraid.'" She paused. "So, went to the post office and I sent it before I could think about it anymore." He looked at her in the long light. "Am very glad you sent it," he said. She looked back at him. "So am I," she said quietly, and then leaned her head slightly against his shoulder, which was a thing she had never done before. And he sat very still for a moment, and then put his arm around her shoulders, and they sat like that watching the sun go down over the Cimarron land. On an evening in late June, he walked her back to where she had hitched the mare, and in the warm dark before she mounted, he turned to her and said, without preamble and without decoration, "I love you, Clara." She went very still. "Have been trying to find the right moment to say it and the right words, and I have concluded that there is no right moment and the right words are simply the true ones," he said. "I love you. Have loved you since somewhere around the 2nd hour on the trail when you told me you had 0 regrets about those 3 trunks, and I have been getting more certain of it every day since." Clara stood in the warm June dark looking at him, and her expression went through about three things in quick succession before it settled on the one that was underneath all the others, the one that was simply and entirely her, open and true. "I love you too," she said. "Have been trying to find the right way to say that for several weeks, and I was beginning to think I should just write it in a letter since that is apparently how I communicate best." He laughed, and she laughed, and then he cupped her face in his hands with a gentleness that he hoped said everything the words had not quite reached, and he kissed her under the Kansas stars on the edge of his own land, and she kissed him back with a certainty that matched his exactly. She rode back to Dodge that night with her heart in a state of productive disorder, and he stood watching the lantern of her mare bob away into the dark for a long time before turning back toward the canvas tent he was still living in while the house was built. In the days that followed, something shifted between them, not in the comfortable ease they had built up, which remained exactly as it was, but in the openness of it, the willingness to simply be two people who loved each other and were not pretending otherwise. He began to meet her at the schoolhouse at the end of her school days when his work on the homestead allowed it, and they would walk together up Front Street or sit in the small park beside the post office. And Dodge City noted this development with the kind of communal attention that small towns of any era and location apply to romances. Widow Patterson told Clara she thought Caleb was a fine and serious man. Bess Hartley, learning of the situation in a letter from Clara that passed through the trading post, sent a jar of her preserved peaches with a note that said she had thought as much from the beginning. Deputy Garrett, encountering Caleb at the livery, said nothing but gave him a slow, assessing look, and then a nod that conveyed a considerable amount. Caleb proposed formally in August, on a Sunday afternoon at the homestead. The house was essentially complete by then, rough but solid, 4 rooms and a proper fireplace, and the kitchen garden Clara had specified on the south side, where 3 rows of late-season vegetables were achieving things that surprised even him. He had spent the previous Thursday in the jewelry portion of the Dodge City Mercantile, a small and not well-stocked section, having a careful conversation with the proprietor about what was available, and had come away with a ring that was simple and not expensive, a thin gold band with a small garnet, all that the mercantile had in stock, but which he had chosen because the stone was the color of the earth on his land in the early morning, which seemed right. He did not plan a speech. He knew himself well enough to know that speeches were not his medium, and that Clara would see through a rehearsed one anyway. She was in the kitchen garden inspecting the tomato plants when he came to stand beside her and said her name. She turned, dusting her hands on her apron, and looked at him, and then at the ring in his hand, and then back at him. "Clara Ashworth," he said. "I love you, and I am building a life here that I would like to spend with you. Cannot promise that everything will be easy. This is hard country, and I am an ordinary man who is doing his best. But I can promise that I will always tell you the truth, that I will work every day to deserve what you give me, and that whatever I have will always be yours." Clara's eyes were very bright. She reached out and took the ring from his hand, looked at it, turned it in the light. "A garnet," she said. "It was the best option available," he said with complete honesty. "If you want something different, we can. It's the color of the earth here in the morning," she said, which was exactly what he had thought. She looked up at him. "Of course I'll marry you, Caleb. I was beginning to wonder if you were going to make me propose to you." He took the ring from her hand and put it on her finger, and she looked at it there against the dark soil of the garden, and then she stepped into him and he held her, and the Kansas summer was warm around them, and the creek ran clear beyond the house, and everything felt, for a long and perfect moment, exactly as it should. They were married in October of 1874, on a day of extraordinary blue sky and sharp autumn air that smelled of turned earth and wood smoke. Clara had insisted on a church wedding, which required the involvement of the Methodist minister who had arrived in Dodge in September, a young man named Reverend Cole, who was enthusiastic and slightly nervous, and who performed the ceremony with admirable seriousness. Widow Patterson served as a witness. Santos and Pete stood up as witnesses on Caleb's side. Bess and Orville Hartley made the 2-day journey from their trading post specifically to be present, which moved Clara more than she showed. Clara wore a dress she had made herself from blue wool she had purchased in September, not a traditional white, which she had decided was impractical and somewhat beside the point, and her hair was pinned up with a precision that made Caleb think of the first morning on the trail, when she had done it with a handful of pins from the canvas bag in the gray pre-dawn light. The garnet ring was on her left hand. When Reverend Cole got to the part about the vows, they looked at each other with the direct, clear gaze of two people who meant every word, and the church, which held about 20 people, most of the town having decided to be present out of the communal interest that Dodge City had taken in the proceedings, was very quiet. After the ceremony, there was a supper at the cafe, where the proprietor had been persuaded by Widow Patterson to make a proper wedding dinner, and there was fiddle music provided by a cowboy from the Long Branch who turned out to have a remarkable gift for it, and dancing on the cafe's wooden floor until Widow Patterson decided the hour was suitable for everyone to go home. Clara and Caleb drove out to the homestead in the wagon he had acquired in September, under a sky full of October stars. The mare was tied to the back, everything Clara owned still in 2 trunks, because the third had become a fixture in the schoolhouse was loaded in the wagon bed. The house was ready. He had finished the interior in the last 2 weeks, including shelving in the main room and a proper kitchen table. He had spent 3 weeks building because Clara had looked at it in the mercantile and said she could do better, and he had taken this as a challenge. The table was, in fact, very good. She had said so. He carried her over the threshold because she had not asked him to, and he wanted to, and she laughed that full, warm, genuine laugh and held onto his shoulders, and he set her down inside their house, and they stood in the lamplight looking at what they had made, and there are no words that are quite adequate for that moment, so it will simply be said that it was very good. The first winter on the homestead was hard in the way that Kansas winters are hard. The wind off the prairie is uncompromising, and the cold arrives with a thoroughness that demands respect. But the house held, and the fireplace drew well, and Caleb had put up enough wood in October that they were never cold without being able to do something about it. Clara continued teaching through the winter, riding the mare into town on most days, and coming home in the evenings with the particular satisfaction of someone who is doing exactly what they were meant to do. Her school had grown. By December, there were 22 children on her register, including 3 children who were the sons and daughters of an Osage family who had settled near Dodge, a situation that produced exactly the opinions Caleb had warned her about, and which Clara handled exactly as he had known she would, which was to say calmly, firmly, and without apology. She spoke to Prescott directly when he came to her with concerns. She spoke to the parents who had complaints directly as well. She ran her school on the principle her father had given her. Every child deserved to have their name written in the register and to be taught what they needed to learn, and she did not deviate from it. Caleb found that he had married a woman who was, in the ways that counted, unmovable, and that this was one of the things he loved most about her. He had cattle by spring, 12 head of good breeding stock purchased from a rancher named Fenwick who was consolidating his operation farther south, and 2 horses of his own beyond the Rhone, the latter of whom he had purchased from Duval as a retirement gift to an animal that had served him well. The homestead had taken shape over the winter into something recognizable as a working ranch of modest size, with a proper barn and a chicken coop and the kitchen garden, which Clara was planning to triple in the spring. In March of 1875, Clara told him, over breakfast on a Tuesday morning with the spring sunlight coming through the east-facing window exactly as it was meant to, that she was expecting a child. He put down his coffee cup. He looked at her. She was looking back at him with that expression she wore when she had said something significant and was giving him the time to catch up, patient and steady. "A child," he said. "In September, by my estimation," she said. He got up from his chair and went to her side of the table and took her face in his hands exactly as he had under the June stars when he first told her he loved her, and he said absolutely nothing because there were no adequate words and they both knew it. She put her hands over his. "I'm very happy," she said, "in case you were wondering." "I was not wondering," he said, "but I'm glad you said it." The spring and summer were busy in the way that a working homestead demands, planting and cattle and fencing, and the 100 tasks that multiply in warm weather, but there was a quality to the busyness that was different from all the years of work before it. Because now the work was his own and Clara's, building their life by their own hands, and the evenings after supper on the porch facing east were the best of all the kinds of evenings Caleb had ever known. Clara continued teaching until the end of August, when the baby made the daily ride impractical, and spent September at the homestead preparing in the methodical, thorough way that she approached everything. She had corresponded with the doctor in Dodge, arranged for Widow Patterson to come out, and acquired everything she deemed necessary with the efficiency of a woman who had done her research. Caleb managed, in the weeks leading up to September, to feel approximately 11 simultaneous things at once, which was new to him, and which Clara found gently amusing. "You are going to wear a path in the floor," she told him, one evening when he had gotten up twice from the supper table for no particular purpose. "I'm not anxious," he said. "Of course not," she agreed with perfect composure. The baby came on the 15th of September, 1875, with Widow Patterson and the doctor both present and Caleb in the barn, managing his feelings among the horses, which was where Clara had told him to go, and he had obeyed because she had used the tone that indicated it was not a suggestion. When Widow Patterson came to the barn door and told him it was done and both mother and child were well, he was at the door before she finished the sentence. Clara was sitting up in bed with a small, red-faced, enormously vocal child in her arms, looking exhausted and absolutely magnificent, and she looked up when Caleb came to her side and said, "It's a boy." He sat on the edge of the bed very carefully and looked at his son with an expression that he was aware was probably not dignified, but could not quite manage to moderate. "He has your eyes," Clara said. "Already, which I understand is unusual at this stage, but it's quite clear." The baby did not yet, in any meaningful way, have any discernible eye color at all, being an extremely recent arrival to the world, and Caleb told Clara this. "I know what I see," she said firmly, which he supposed settled that. They named him James after Clara's father, with the middle name of Thomas after Caleb's father. James Thomas Morrow made his opinion of the world known consistently, and at volume for the first several months of his existence, and Caleb discovered that he could rock a baby to sleep on the porch while watching the prairie with a contentment that was unlike anything he had previously experienced. It was not unlike the feeling of sitting on a good horse on a ridge overlooking a valley, that sense of being exactly in the right place at the right time. Clara went back to teaching in November, bringing James to the schoolhouse for the first month in a basket that she kept beside her desk, until he was old enough to be left with the rancher's wife who lived nearest to town and who had offered her services. The children in the school were fascinated by James and treated him with a reverence that Clara found educational in its own right. The school had grown to 30 students by the following spring, and Prescott had been persuaded after a committee meeting at which Clara had presented a written case supported by enrollment numbers, projected growth figures, and a comparison of school sizes in towns of similar population, to approve the construction of a second room. Caleb built half of it himself and hired Santos for the other half. The years moved the way good years do, not slowly, not quickly, but with the rich density of time that is full of events and changes. The homestead grew. The cattle herd reached 40 head by 1877, and Caleb hired a part-time hand, a weathered man named Henry who had been working cattle for 30 years and who proved invaluable. The kitchen garden became, under Clara's systematic attention, a genuine growing operation. She canned enough tomatoes, beans, corn, and preserves each autumn to carry them through winter with abundance, and she had started growing medicinal herbs along the south fence that she dried and supplied to the doctor in Dodge, who was grateful. James turned to and began walking with the determined wobbliness of a person who has decided that crawling is beneath his dignity. He had, as Clara had predicted, gray-green eyes, Caleb's eyes exactly, and Clara's strong features and her father's name, and he was as stubborn as both of them in equal measure, and as curious about the world as either of them, which meant he needed a more or less constant eye kept on him, because curiosity without caution is a liability on a working ranch. In the summer of 1877, Clara told Caleb over breakfast again she had a pattern for important announcements he had noticed, involving the breakfast table and the east-facing window, that there would be a second baby in December. This time, he was rather better at managing the 11 simultaneous feelings. He was still not perfect at it, but improved. The second child, born December of 1877, was a girl. She had Clara's amber-brown eyes and Caleb's determined set to her jaw, and she was, unlike James, an exceptionally serene baby who observed the world with the careful, measuring attention of someone taking notes. They named her Alina after no one in particular, because they both simply loved the name, and called her Ellie, which suited her exactly. James was 2 years and 3 months old when Ellie arrived, and he regarded her with deep suspicion for approximately 10 days before deciding that she was interesting, after which he was insufferably devoted to her in the way that older siblings sometimes are, territorial on her behalf, and gentle with her in ways he was not always gentle with anyone else. Life on the homestead in those years had the quality of something being built, not finished, not complete, but genuinely in progress in all the ways that matter. Caleb would come in from the field in the evening to find Clara at the kitchen table with her school papers and a lamp, correcting work or preparing lessons, or writing the letters she wrote faithfully each week to her mother in Ohio, who had eventually made her peace with the situation after Caleb had written a letter of introduction that Clara said was so thoroughly honest and courteous that her mother had practically no choice but to approve. To Bess Hartley at the trading post, to a colleague in Philadelphia with whom she corresponded about education methods. He would set coffee on because he always made coffee. It was non-negotiable, and she would look up from her papers and the lamplight would catch her face, and he would feel, every time, a version of what he had felt on the trail on the first evening when she had said 0 regrets. She was extraordinary. He was aware of this every day. In 1879, James started at the school, Clara's school, at age 4, which was slightly younger than usual, but which she had determined was appropriate given his developmental progress, a conclusion she had reached with the same thorough methodology she applied to everything. There was some discussion among the parents of other students about whether this was appropriate given that she was his mother, and Clara addressed this directly at the next town meeting by pointing out that she applied the same standards to James as to every other student, a fact that James himself could have confirmed by his expression when she assigned him extra work for talking during quiet time. Caleb, hearing about this from Deputy Garrett, who had been at the town meeting, had a conversation with James that evening. That was one of the highlights of his parenting experience. "Did you talk during quiet time?" Caleb asked. James, age 4, gave him the look of a person who considers talking during quiet time a reasonable life choice. "I had something to say," he said. "At school," Caleb said with great care, "your mother is your teacher." James considered this. "She's the teacher and my mama." "Both at once," Caleb confirmed. And when she gives an instruction at school, she gives it as the teacher. James appeared to find this philosophically complicated. You do what she says, Caleb said, at home and at school. The reasons are slightly different, but the result is the same. James said nothing for a moment and then, with the air of a person making a pragmatic decision, "All right." "Good," Caleb said. Clara, from the other room where she had been doing an impressive job of not laughing, allowed herself one small, quiet, entirely private laugh, and went back to her school papers. The spring of 1880 brought a dry stretch that concerned every rancher and farmer in the county the creek on the homestead held. But the grass on the higher ground went thin, and Caleb spent 3 weeks in April and May hauling water and managing the cattle with the meticulous anxiety of someone who knows exactly how close the margin is. Henry earned every cent of his wages that month. Clara, with her herb garden and her canned provisions, ran the household with a calm efficiency that kept everything functional while Caleb was doing what needed doing outside. And on the evenings when he came in tired to the marrow, she put supper on the table and sat with him, and did not try to talk when he needed quiet and talked when he needed to process out loud. And it was this as much as anything else that made him understand what people meant when they said they had a partner. The dry stretch broke in June with a week of good rain that turned the grass green overnight and brought the creek up and lifted the mood of every farm and ranch within 50 miles. And the 4th of July celebration in Dodge City that year had the particular effervescence of people who have come through something difficult and are genuinely glad to be standing on the other side of it. The Morrow family attended the celebration. Caleb, Clara, James at 4.5 and Ellie at 2.5, who had discovered the concept of fireworks with an enthusiasm that was somewhat alarming and entirely characteristic. Clara ran into Bess Hartley, who had come to Dodge for the occasion, and the two women disappeared for an hour into the kind of conversation that covers everything from herb preservation to the politics of the local school board to the general state of the frontier. And when they emerged, they were both bright-eyed and clearly satisfied. Caleb watched his son run across the open ground of the fairground after a ball being kicked by a group of older children, confident and stubborn and absolutely fearless, and held his daughter on his hip while she watched the preparations for the fireworks display with eyes that were taking everything in, cataloging it, preparing her response. He thought about the ridge above the Santa Fe Trail 6 years ago. The woman with 3 trunks and no driver and the broken wagon axle and the axle grease on her cheek, and the expression of someone who had already done their grieving and moved on. He thought about the 2 days on the trail, and the coffee in the pre-dawn gray, and the peppermint candy she had offered him as they rode, and the way she had said 0 regrets plainly, without decoration, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Clara appeared at his elbow and took Ellie from him with the practiced smoothness of a woman who has been transferring a 2-year-old between adults for 2 years and has it down to an art. She leaned against his shoulder briefly, looking out at the fairground. "Good day," she said. "Very good day," he said. She looked up at him. She had a smear of something on her cheek frosting from the cake she and Bess had been eating while they talked, and she had not yet noticed. He reached up and wiped it away with his thumb gently, and she caught his hand and held it against her cheek for a moment, looking at him with those amber-brown eyes that he had been learning and relearning for 6 years and was not yet finished with. "I have something to tell you," she said, "that I was going to wait until this evening to say." He went still. "Another one," she said simply. He looked at her. She was 31 now, and the frontier years had put a depth in her face that the girl from the trail had not yet had, and she was more beautiful to him than she had been then, which he had not thought possible. "When?" he said. "February, I think," she said. Ellie chose this moment to make her opinion about the delay of the fireworks display known in volume and clear terms, and James came pelting back across the grass toward them, breathless, to report that the older children were cheating at the ball game, and Caleb lifted James onto his shoulders so he could see over. The crowd and Clara held Ellie against her hip, and the fireworks went off overhead in red and gold, and white against the dark Kansas sky. And James shouted his delight from Caleb's shoulders. And Ellie grabbed Clara's collar and said something emphatic in the half-formed language of a 2-year-old that everyone present understood as approval. The third child, a boy, came in February of 1881 and arrived with considerably less drama than either of the previous two, as though he had already decided to be practical about it. They named him Daniel, and he was from the first a child of easy temperament and bright, observant eyes, who watched the world from his basket with the air of someone gathering information against future need. By 1882, the homestead along the Cimarron was, by any measure, a working success. The cattle herd was 63 head and growing. Caleb had bought the adjoining quarter section and was running cattle on it with Henry and a second hand, a young man newly arrived from Missouri named Willis, who was learning fast and earning his wages. The house had been expanded, a second story added, with 2 more bedrooms that James and Ellie occupied with the territorial certainty of children, who consider their rooms a sovereign territory. Clara's school was the longest-running and best-attended school in the county. She had trained 2 assistant teachers, a young woman named Helen, who had come from St. Louis the previous year, and an older man, Mr. Foss, who had been a printer in Kansas City, and brought to the school a skill for arithmetic that complemented Clara's strengths. The school had 82 children enrolled. Clara ran the whole operation with the organized, principled efficiency of someone who has been refining their methodology for 8 years, and has gotten it very good indeed. She was, in the town and in the county, respected in a way that was specific, and earned not the vague respect extended as a courtesy to women who are school teachers, but the genuine respect given to someone who had done something demonstrably important and done it well. When there was a disagreement about the school curriculum, people came to Clara. When there was a question about what a child needed, parents brought it to her. When the county proposed combining several school districts in a way that would have reduced resources to the smaller community schools, Clara appeared before the county board with a written argument that was so well organized and evidenced that the proposal was tabled within the hour. Caleb heard about the county board meeting from 3 different people before he had heard it from Clara, and he told her so. "You should have been there," she said, with the modest satisfaction of someone who does not need external validation but is not opposed to it either. "Was fixing the south fence," he said. "It couldn't wait." "No," she agreed. "The south fence cannot wait." He looked at her across the kitchen table, at this woman he had found on a trail in 1874 with 3 trunks and a broken axle and more certainty of purpose than anyone he had ever met. 8 years. 3 children asleep upstairs, 63 cattle, 82 school children, 1 kitchen garden that was, at this point, basically a small farm in its own right. "Clara," he said. She looked up from the school papers. "I want you to know," he said, "that I think about that trail every day, not because I wish things were different, because I don't, because what came from those 2 days is everything sitting in front of me." She put down her pencil. She looked at him with the direct, open gaze that had not changed in 8 years, that quality of honest attention that said, "Think you are strong enough for the truth, and here is mine." "I know," she said. "Think about it too." A pause. "I also think about the fact that I was sitting beside a broken wagon axle, considering whether to simply walk to the nearest town and drag 1 trunk behind me, and then you came over that ridge, and the first thing you said was afternoon." "That's what I said," he confirmed. "It was the most ordinary, remarkable thing," she said. "Just afternoon, like it was the most natural thing in the world to find a woman with 3 trunks on an empty trail." "It was natural," he said. "Everything about it was natural." She smiled, and it was the full, undefended, devastating smile that had broken through for the first time in the Dodge City schoolhouse on that first morning, and it had not lost any of its impact in 8 years, which he suspected was not going to change. "You were right about the land," she said. "The morning light, east-facing." "You told me to face it east," he said. "I was right about that," she said. "Which is different." He laughed, and she laughed, and from upstairs there was the small, sleepy, indeterminate sound of Daniel stirring, and then settling again, and the prairie wind moved through the cottonwoods along the creek outside, and the lamp on the kitchen table cast its warm, steady light over the papers and the coffee cups, and the two people who had built something real from 2 days on a trail, and 3 trunks of books, and a decision to be honest about what they wanted. James turned 7 that year, and had decided that he wanted to be a cattle rancher, and also possibly a teacher, which Clara told him with perfect seriousness was not mutually exclusive, and which Caleb told him with equal seriousness would require him to listen during quiet time in school, which James received with the philosophical equanimity of a 7-year-old who has long since made his peace with certain non-negotiable realities. Ellie was 5 and had started school officially, as a student, which was a distinction that Clara made very clear on the first day, explaining to Ellie in advance that at school she was Miss Morrow's student first and her daughter second, and Ellie had nodded with the calm of someone who understood complicated arrangements and would navigate them efficiently, which she then proceeded to do. She was, Clara noted with a combination of parental pride and professional assessment, extremely good at reading, and had a gift for noticing what other people needed, which made her popular with the younger students in a way that was instinctive and genuine. Daniel was learning to walk that autumn, doing it with the same practical, unhurried approach he brought to everything, and he and the 2 cats that lived in the barn had an ongoing relationship of mutual curiosity that Caleb found one of the most entertaining features of daily life. On an evening in October of 1882, the exact month and year of their 8th anniversary, though they celebrated it simply, with supper at home and the children in bed early, Caleb sat on the east-facing porch of the house he had built, in the cool October air, and thought with a completeness that rarely comes to people that he was satisfied. Not complacent, not finished, but satisfied in the way that means, this is what was supposed to happen, and it has. Clara came and sat beside him, bringing 2 cups of coffee she had learned to make it his way over the years, which she had once told him was one of the more meaningful concessions she had made in the marriage, delivered with enough dryness that he had laughed for a full minute. She handed him his cup and sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched, and looked out at the Cimarron land in the dark, the grass and the sky and the creek they could hear but not see. "I have been thinking," she said, "about the school. What about it? Helen is ready to take on more responsibility. Think in another year or 2 she could run the primary grades entirely on her own, which would free me to focus on the upper grades and the curriculum work." She paused. "I have also been corresponding with a woman in Wichita who is trying to establish a network of frontier schools sharing resources, curriculum, teacher training. Would like to be involved." He turned to look at her profile in the dark, the strong, clear line of it, the familiar tilt of her chin when she was working something out. "You're expanding," he said. "I'm always expanding," she said, with the simplicity of someone stating a fact about their nature. "I cannot help it." "I know," he said. "I wouldn't want you to." She turned to look at him. There was a quality to her expression in that moment, the open, amber-brown gaze catching what little light there was that he had seen before and that never failed to be exactly what it was. A person looking at another person with the full weight of knowing them and choosing them anyway. "Neither would I," she said quietly. "Want me to?" He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned against him, and they drank their coffee in the October dark while the prairie made its night sounds around them, the creek and the wind, and somewhere in the distance the cattle moving in the field, and the house behind them warm with lamplight and the small, sleeping sounds of 3 children whose existence still struck him, sometimes, as remarkable enough to take his breath. 8 years from the trail, From the broken axle and the three trunks lined up in a row with almost mathematical precision. From the woman who had stood with her hands on her hips in the dust and said, with complete calm, that her driver had decided his obligations ended the moment he was out of sight and had already, by that point, begun working out what to do next. Zero regrets, she had said. He had known then that something was happening, something he could not name yet, in the way that a man who has spent his life reading the signs of country he is traveling through knows, before he can fully articulate why, that the land ahead is good. He had been right. The land ahead had been extraordinary. The network of frontier schools that Clara became involved in grew quickly in the following years, and by 1885, she was traveling occasionally by train now, the Kansas Pacific having made travel considerably different from what it had been in 1874 to Wichita, and once to Topeka for conferences, which she attended with her notebooks and her lists, and her unfailing capacity to ask questions that went off the syllabus. Helen took over the primary grades entirely in 1884, and the Dodge City School was, by any measure, one of the best-run schools in the county. Clara had written a curriculum guide that was copied and distributed to 7 other frontier schools. When the county proposed, in 1885, to formalize teacher certification requirements, Clara was one of 3 people asked to serve on the committee developing the standards. Caleb's ranch by 1885 was genuinely prosperous 90 head of cattle, well-managed land, the homestead producing enough that the kitchen garden and preserved goods covered the household food requirements almost entirely. He had paid off the land claims years ago. He had 2 good hands in Henry and Willis. He was not a wealthy man in any eastern city sense of the word, but he was a man who owned what he had built and owed nothing to anyone for it. And on the Kansas frontier in 1885, this was a solid and respectable thing. James, at age 10, was deeply interested in horses with a focused passion that Caleb recognized and respected. He had begun helping with the horses in the barn with a seriousness that exceeded what Caleb had managed to hold at the same age, and he asked questions about bloodlines and training and care that required genuine answers. Caleb gave them all, and found in the giving of them a particular pleasure, not the pleasure of imparting information, but the pleasure of watching a mind that was its own, working. Ellie, at 8, was Clara's child in all the most recognizable ways. She was reading at a level that put her several years ahead of her schoolmates. She had begun keeping a journal with an orderliness that made Clara smile with recognition, and she had taken it upon herself to tutor 2 younger children in reading after school, with an authority that was entirely self-appointed and entirely effective. Daniel, at 4, had determined that the best place in the world was in or near water of any kind, a preference that made the creek both his greatest joy and the most reliable source of parental concern on the homestead. It was Clara who one evening in the fall of 1885, sitting at the kitchen table with her school papers, put down her pencil and said, "I got a letter from my mother today." Caleb, who was at the stove, turned. Clara's mother, Margaret Ashworth of Columbus, Ohio, who had called her daughter stubborn and impractical in 1874, had been a regular correspondent, their relationship having settled over the years into something that was respectful if not uncomplicated. "She is thinking of coming to visit," Clara said. "Good," Caleb said and meant it. Clara looked at him. "She has never been west of Pittsburgh." "I know. She will have opinions about everything." "I expect so," he said. "We'll manage." Clara considered this. "She will want to see the school," she said. "She'll have opinions about that too." "What did your father say about opinions?" Caleb asked. Clara looked at him for a moment and then laughed. "He said they were the most honest evidence of a person's engagement with the world," she said. "He said a person who has no opinions has stopped paying attention." "Your mother," Caleb said, "has clearly been paying attention." Margaret Ashworth arrived in Dodge City in April of 1886 on the Kansas Pacific train, with 2 bags and an expression of cautious assessment that Clara recognized as the face her mother wore when she was preparing to be impressed, but would not admit it yet. She was a small, sharp-eyed woman of 62 who wore her age with the dignity of someone who has made all her important decisions and is confident they were correct. She met her 3 grandchildren, James, now 11, who greeted her with serious courtesy, Ellie, 9, who offered her a jar of the preserved peaches she had helped Clara make and explained the preservation process in detail that Margaret found unexpectedly engaging, and Daniel, 5, who showed her the creek, which was the highest honor he could bestow. She toured the school, where Helen was teaching the morning session. She walked the homestead. She ate at the kitchen table that Caleb had built. On the second evening of her visit, when the children were in bed and Clara was doing her papers, and Caleb was at the table with his ranch accounts, Margaret Ashworth sat in the good chair by the fireplace and looked around the room with an expression that had finally given up its caution. "You have done well," she said, to Clara and Caleb equally, which from Margaret was a statement of considerable significance. "We've worked at it," Clara said without false modesty. "Your father would have approved," Margaret said. Of all of it, she looked at Caleb directly. "He would have liked you," she said. Caleb received this. "I hope I would have deserved it," he said. "You would have," Margaret said, with a certainty that settled the matter. She stayed 3 weeks, and by the end of it she had rearranged Clara's herb garden according to a system she considered superior, had involved herself in a school supply fundraising effort with an energy that impressed even Helen, and had given Caleb her assessment of every horse on the property, which was detailed and accurate. She left on the Kansas Pacific train with the expression of someone who has been thoroughly satisfied by what they found and is willing to say so. She loved it, Ellie told Caleb, after watching the train leave from the platform. "She did," Caleb agreed. "She didn't want to say so," James observed. "But it was obvious." "Honesty," Clara said from beside Caleb with the small private smile that was just for him, "takes different forms in different people." He took her hand as they turned from the platform, and she held it, and the 5 of them walked back through Dodge City toward the wagon, James and Ellie debating something with the particular passionate specificity of siblings, whose argument has origins too far back to be clearly traced, and Daniel between Caleb and Clara, holding one hand of each. The years continued, as years do, each one different from the last in the ways that matter and similar in the ways that are comfortable. The ranch grew. The school continued to be the best in the county. The children grew into themselves with the particular confidence of people who have been raised by parents who told them the truth and expected them to be capable, which they were. In 1889, when Kansas statehood was a fixture of history, and the frontier was changing the wild, open character of the trail years, softening into something more settled and complex, Caleb and Clara sat on the east-facing porch on a warm summer evening and watched the light go over the Cimarron land. James was 14 and had the horses in hand with a skill that made even Henry shake his head with admiration. Ellie was 12 and had written an essay about the history of the Cimarron River that Clara had sent, without telling Ellie, to the correspondent in Wichita, who had published it in the Frontier School Network's quarterly letter. And Ellie's expression when she was told had been one of the best things Caleb had seen in a year of good things. Daniel was 8 and had a collection of creek stones that occupied an entire shelf in his room, and which he catalogued with a methodical attention to detail that suggested either a future naturalist or a future professor, possibly both. "Do you ever miss the trail?" Clara asked, on that warm 1889 evening. He thought about it because she asked things seriously and deserved serious answers. "I miss the simplicity of it sometimes," he said. "The way everything was just the next mile, the next water, the next stop. And now, Now everything is more complicated and considerably better, he said. I don't miss simplicity enough to prefer it. She was quiet for a moment. I don't miss Philadelphia, she said. I thought I might, eventually. I don't. She paused. I miss the library, but I've built something like one between the school and this house. He looked at the walls of the house, which were, it was true, substantially covered in books at this point, the two original trunks' worth having multiplied significantly over the years through purchase, trade, and the donations of grateful parents who had no better way to express their appreciation for what Clara had done for their children. You have, he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The evening light moved across the land that was theirs, the grass and the creek and the cattle in the distance, and the barn with its horses, all of it built from 2 days on a trail and 3 trunks, and a ring that was the color of the morning earth, and a proposal in a kitchen garden, and a wedding in a small church on a blue October day. All of it built from her sitting on a broken wagon and deciding, before he ever appeared over the ridge, that whatever came next, she was going to manage it without regrets. That was what he loved most, he thought. Not just her, though, her, entirely, but that quality she had brought to all of it, to every hard day and good day and complicated day on the homestead and in the school and in the life they had built. The quality of a person who had looked at everything in front of her, known exactly what it would cost, and chosen it anyway with her whole heart. 0 regrets. He had adopted it as his own philosophy somewhere along the way, without noticing the exact moment it happened. The way you absorb the best things from the people you love, not by trying, but by living close enough to them long enough that their truest self starts to shape your own. The stars came out over the Cimarron, one by one, and then all at once the way they do on the Kansas prairie, enormous and close. And the wind moved through the cottonwoods along the creek with that particular sound that had been the background to 15 years of evenings on this land. From inside the house came the sound of James and Ellie, not arguing for once, their voices a companionable murmur over something they were reading, and the measured footsteps of Daniel heading, in his practical way, to bed. Caleb held Clara on the east-facing porch of the house he had built on land he had filed the claim for because of a conversation on a trail about land along the Cimarron, and she held him back with the easy certainty of a woman who had come 1,100 miles with 3 trunks and a signed contract, and a conviction that the difficult thing was worth doing, and who had been proven right in ways she had not entirely anticipated but had never, not for a single day, regretted. The prairie breathed around them under its impossible stars. It was a very good evening, one of the best of many, and neither of them said so aloud because neither of them needed to. It was simply true. The way the creek was true, and the east-facing window was true, and the coffee every morning was true, settled and certain and entirely theirs. The life they had built from a chance meeting on a dusty trail with a woman who had decided, before anyone came over any ridge, that wherever she was going with everything she had and without a single regret.